Hello, welcome back to episode 2, looking today at bone needles. Now in the last one I happened to have some amber on my desk, but weirdly enough I don't have bits of bone on my desk. I say that as if it's a sarcastic thing, but actually that is kind of weird because I have been doing a lot of experiments making bone needles for my current PhD thesis, so you would think that I had some hanging around, but I don't. So we're going to have to head off and get some material again. This time, however, we're not going down to the woodshed, we're going down to the basement. Because I keep my skins in the same place that I use, I'm going to talk about this a bit more in a sec, and they need to be kept cool, and it's nice and cool in the basement. So, let's go get some stuff. I keep forgetting that I've stored things down here that I really need to come down and sort out at some point. So my dry suit for scuba diving and things. So I need to move them out of the way before I can access the box with all my stuff in it. So we need to get out this box here. So we have all sorts of things. There's some bits of seal skin, caribou skin that we have. Ivory, walrus tusk. Don't worry, all ethically sourced. And I'll explain more about that later in the video. Okay, so, here it is. This is what we're going to be using today. This is a piece of caribou leg bone. So I will take that upstairs. We have to see how much it smells. I might have to do some work outside today. Maybe I'll just do it down here actually because it's bloomin' hot outside. So put that aside. What did I have in these? These, by the way, are fantastic for holding little trinkety things like needles, for example. But I think I don't need although I will need them for when I'm making. Yes, I'll take these up as well. Yes, that too. Okay. This is my little magic experiment box, which has all sorts of things in it, mainly bones though, so I don't think I need them for now, although again I probably will need them for the other experiments, so I'll take that up as well. And what I need is my tools. Where? Ta-da! So these are all of my stone tools, specifically the ones that I use for my needle making experiment. So, go. Okay, so let's have a look at what we got here. So we have this beautiful caribou bone, which, doesn't smell too bad. It mainly smells sort of oily, greasy. We'll see how it goes. I'm currently in my office, but it's just because it's very, very hot out there. So I don't particularly want to go outside and work because it's really warm, but I might have to if it gets a bit chilly in here. And then we have various stone tools, and the ones that I need are scrapers and burins. So here we have some burins, and these were made for me by an amazing colleague of mine who, it just goes to show the power of social media, because I had been posting when I was doing experiments on making needles, and I was posting some pictures saying, oh, it's so annoying, like it just doesn't get, sharp as much, and like the tools that I'm using aren't sharp enough, and it's not working properly, and but I'm just pretty rubbish at flint knapping. I can do touch-ups on the edges, which I might show at some point in the video, but I'm just really rubbish at actually knapping new tools, if that makes sense. So I need to use sort of pre-made ones and then just touch up as I go, which it gets to a certain point where you can't really touch up anymore. But yes, so I posted this on my social media, and then a colleague of mine who is an expert flint knapper basically commented and said, well, hey, I'll make you some burins. Just send me a link. So for those of you wondering what a burin actually is. So burins look like This is a beautiful example here, which is probably the one I will use actually. They look like this. So they're basically a type of little flint blade, and the kind of defining factor of a burin is that it has this little nick called a burin spall taken out of it. And the nice thing is my colleague also gave me the spalls because they were also used as little sort of drilling or piercing tools for quite a lot of things. So we have a wide selection here of different ones from different materials. So here you have a much wider one, for example, but again, you've got this little typical shoulder here, and then there's the little burin spalls. And these are all made from different kinds of flint, different kinds of burin spalls. And I must say that I'm not as expert when it comes to this kind of thing. So exactly what they would have used all these for in other contexts, I'm not so sure, but they definitely were using them for making needles, because we see nice little toolkits in other cultures as well. So it's also assumed that they were making needles with little burins in the Arctic. And then we also need a scraper. And this is because I want to use this needle for my own experiments for my PhD, which means that unlike sometimes with needles, you were grinding them to shape, so you were like rubbing them on a grinding stone, similar to how I did with the amber bead in the last video. With the culture that I'm looking at, which I'll get to in a second, they actually were scraping it along with stones instead. So I want to use scrapers, which look like... So this, for example, is a really nice example of a scraper. So basically you'd have one edge that's pretty flat, and then the top edge there is kind of curved. So ideally this would have been usually hafted in some kind of handle, and generally it was used for scraping skins, so you'd be scraping it like this. So that's what these are made for, and what these are still quite often used for as well in a lot of cultures. So this is sort of the size as well. A lot of people are surprised at how small they are, but they're quite small, but they're very, very effective. And I will be using one today to scrape the surface of needles to make them into a general nice needly shape. So I just washed the bone, which got rid of a lot of the grease, which is quite nice. So now it's not quite so greasy, which is good. So first of all, I realized I can't actually, well, I could probably use the burin for cutting it, but I would rather not blunt my burin in that part because I need to use it to make the preform later. So first I need to grab another stone tool, and then we can get cutting. So if you're wondering what I'm actually doing, because I realized I completely forgot to mention it when my original recordings. So basically what I'm trying to do here is cut out a little bone panel that then I can cut down further to create the preforms for the needles. So I first have to cut a little chunk of this bone, the bone, and then hopefully get as flat as possible section, and then cut that further into a little panel, and then that will then be grooved using the groove and split method, which I will talk about in a little more detail later on. And then from that you create the needle preforms. From that you then create the final needle. So it's a lot of different steps down to creating the final piece. So a lot of you might be wondering why I keep referring to my research and my experiments and all of this kind of stuff. So basically the research that I'm doing at the moment is part of my PhD work. So I'm an archaeologist by trade, and I am doing my PhD at the moment at the University of Groningen to extend my expertise and research experience in archaeology. And my the topic of my thesis is Paleo-Inuit organic material culture. So Paleo-Inuit refers to a group of cultures that were living, in my particular case, up in the Canadian Arctic, so in specifically the Fox Basin region. The particular culture that I'm looking at is called the Tuanit or Dorset culture. We'll get into that in a sec. And they lived from around 800 BC to around 1000 AD. So relatively small span, but still quite a long time, and pre-contact, shall we say, with European colonizers. And so that's the group that I'm looking at, and the artifacts, so the material culture refers to the objects, right? The sort of object assemblages that we as archaeologists find in the ground. That is someone's material culture. Your material culture is basically everything material that defines your culture. very, very simplified explanation there, don't quote me on it. But, and organic in this case, so organic material culture, refers to those objects classified as organic, which generally speaking include kind of carbon-based objects or materials. So things that generally degrade quickly, so things like bone, antler, ivory, in my case, but also you have like wood, leather, plant materials, etc. So the nice thing, and this is in contrast, by the way, to inorganic objects, which are generally silicates, so things like rocks, stones, etc. And in the Arctic, of course, you have permafrost, you have freezing temperatures, which generally means that everything is really well preserved. Think of it as like a giant freezer that just beautifully preserves everything. So organic artifacts, which generally in a lot of other places of the world would degrade quite quickly in the ground, in the Arctic, they're actually beautifully preserved. So there's really, really nice material culture assemblages up in the Arctic. And that is why I am looking there, because as you may remember from my previous video, I do microanalysis as my main method. So this means that I look at the microscopic traces on the objects to see how they were made and how they were used. And in order to be able to see this, they obviously have to be well preserved, right? Because if you imagine that a surface is very degraded, how on earth are you going to be able to see anything under the microscope? So for that, the Arctic assemblages are perfect because they have beautiful preservation and you can see really, really nice use wear. And I'll be showing you later some nice needle use wear that I've been looking at. So in terms of the experiments that I've been doing, I am currently doing a paper talking about needle making and needleworking, sewing technologies in these cultures, in the Tunit culture more specifically, which lived from around 800 BC to around 1000 AD. So pre what we would call contact, so before basically the European colonizers arrived in the Arctic. This is when this culture was living. And there's a lot of interesting stuff around this culture. For example, they came from what's known as the pre-Dorset cultures. The word Dorset, by the way, is something that was used a lot by specifically Southern or European researchers coming to the Arctic because the first evidence of this culture was found at Cape Dorset by Jennis back in the day. So it was defined as Dorset. However, Inuit populations living now also refer to these past cultures because even though they are not direct descendants of Tunit, they're direct descendants of Tuli Inuit, which is another ancient culture that lived in the Arctic. They still know all the legends and the mythology about what we have called Dorset, but what Inuit refer to as Tunit. So it's all a bit confusing, but basically there's this culture that lived from 800 BC to 1000 AD. Europeans and Southern researchers referred to them as Dorset, but nowadays we start calling them Tunit, which is the Inuit word, because of course it is Inuit archaeology at the end of the day, even though there are slightly different heritages, shall we say, it's still part of the same broad Paleo-Inuit cultural group. Anyway, lecture over. So full disclosure, I got to a certain point with my sawing of the caribou leg and then realized, of course, it's still got the marrow in it. And it just really stank. And I didn't want to take too long to do it. So I thought, okay, I'll just use a modern saw because this one, I don't necessarily have to do the whole process with the flint in this way. I want to show how it can be used with the flint, but yeah. So I'm going to make a little kind of pre-form with a metal saw just to save my nostrils and basically my day, because otherwise this could take me all day. So needles are, I would argue, one of the most essential items of Paleo-Inuit cultural toolkit, because without them, without clothing, you wouldn't survive in those conditions. I mean, without clothing, we wouldn't survive in the majority of conditions, but especially in Arctic conditions where it's so cold and so freezing, you need to be well insulated. We're not naturally adapted to that kind of thing. So yes, so the needles is one of the most important artifact types. So I wanted to focus on them in a paper. And I basically wanted to look and see whether you could see what kind of skin was being sewn with a needle based purely on the microwear traces. So was this needle used to sew seal skin? Was it used to sew caribou skin? Was it used to sew polar bear skin, fox skin, etc., etc.? The results of that are still being interpreted, so I can't share with you right now, but once the paper is out, then I will be able to update you, and I shall leave a nice link in the description, so hopefully you can read it and find out for yourself, and I'll post a little update video as well at some point. So basically, in order to do this research, I first have to do a ton of experiments myself to create needles and use them for sewing, in order to have then a nice little catalogue, a reference collection, shall we say, of microwear traces that I can then compare with those that I see in the archaeological collections. So the majority of my PhD, among doing other projects, I've also just been sewing with bone and ivory and antler needles, seal skin, caribou skin, fox skin. Yeah, that was it. And yeah, so it's a bit of a weird project, but it's really good fun. By the way, Mum, if you're watching, that was not a real foot. That was a safety boot that looks like a real foot. I hope it goes without saying, they likely wouldn't have had these lovely workstations in Paleo-Inuit culture. It is hot out there. So we have a nice little pre-form. So yes, generally, obviously, archaeologically, the entire process would have been done with a flint tool. However, yeah, I just felt lazy and didn't want to stink too much. Okay, so now what we need to do is go from this little pre-form and create another preform for the needles. And we can see this in the archaeological records. So what they were doing was they were having sort of flattish bits of bone like this, and then they would cut grooves in it to make very, very rough shapes of the needle. And the shapes of the needle would be slightly bigger than the needle itself, of course. So you first do the preform, then you make the hole, then you create the final shape of the needle. And this is quite simply because it's a lot easier to make a hole in a wider piece of bone. I mean, makes sense, right? And you actually see all those different stages in the archaeological records. So you can see the sort of little platforms like this. You can also then see the rough preform shapes made from this, and then rough preform shapes with a hole drilled in, and then, you know, obviously the final needles as well. So that's quite cool. So we know exactly the stages that would have been used to make them. And I'm using here what is known as the groove and split method. So basically, a groove is made in the surface of the bone, and then it's flipped over, and a groove is made in the other side surface of the bone, and then some kind of hammer or wedge is used to split the piece of bone. And that is a very, very common manufacturing technique. We see it a lot, especially in bone, but also in a lot of other materials as well. Actually, it's a very useful way of not having to necessarily get all the way through the material before you have to then break it. What's also quite fun, at least I think it's fun anyway, when you're looking at the archaeological pieces, is that they have been used and then obviously a part of it's broken. So either the tip has been broken and it's been resharpened, or what's really cool is that if you see that the hole has been broken, so it's sort of half a hole, and then they've reperforated another hole underneath, which if you imagine, it must be really difficult, because at that point you don't have this nice wide preform to go on. You just have like the little shape of the needle, and these are very thin needles. They're like 2 millimeters wide, basically. No, maybe two millimeters high, maybe 2 to 4 millimeters wide. Still very, very small, which if you have a tool like this in and then trying to make a little hole, very difficult. So, but you know, waste not, want not, which I think is a lovely philosophy. Anyway, so let's try and make this groove here. So we have a nice, oh, there you go, that's better. You can really see the light shining through the groove that we've created. It's sort of clearer on that side than on this side. So we are going to try and split this now. The groove and split method, by the way, was used to create various other things as well. It wasn't just used for needles, of course, because it is a pretty good way of splitting a lot of materials actually, not even just bone, but a lot of other materials as well. So yeah, so it was quite a popular method. And we know that it happened that way because you find bits that have split wrong, or which, yeah, happened a lot in my experiments as well. So I'm very curious how this is going to be once I split it with this particular one, because I really hope that it splits nicely, because there were a couple of experimental pieces that I had where I was trying to split it and it just like broke in half or something, and yeah, very disappointing. So we're going to go out and see if we can split it, and then it's time to make the hole. So this is what I mean, in that it didn't really split as nicely as I was hoping it would. Okay, so this is the piece that we're gonna try to use. Oh, I've got hiccups. So now what we need to do is make a little hole here on this end, and then we can finish shaping it to the final shape. So what's actually interesting is that generally you see that the holes of needles have been drilled, but actually the particular culture that I'm looking at, so the Tunit culture, they didn't have drilling technology, which is really interesting, especially because the cultures that preceded them and the cultures that came after them did have drilling technology, so it's a bit unsure what's going on in Tunit minds. They were just like, nope, I don't want that drilling technology. That's so old school. I want to do something different. So they would gouge out their holes. So they would basically take the burin and kind of go like this and make a little gouging motion. And you can see that on the archaeological pieces. So if you look at the holes, rather than having a hole like you saw with the amber beads, which had all these nice striations and everything going around it, instead on the needles, the archaeological needles, you see kind of long grooves or gouges that have been then worked from both sides. So the same way, so it's done from both sides biconically, but it's gouged rather than drilled, and then they meet in the middle and form a nice little hole. I'm going to be doing a bit of a mix of both today, just because I find drilling easier. To be perfectly honest, I find drilling easier, but yeah, sometimes you want a bit of a different action to the so you want to be able to go like this instead. So yeah, we'll see how we go. Ah. Only a bit of loss here. This bit chipped off at some point while I was doing it, but yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So as you can see, I drilled it mainly towards the end, just because my wrist was getting a bit sore with all the gouging. So this side I mainly gouged, and this side I mainly drilled. Yeah. So now we need to do some shaping. But generally, you would assume that to shape the needle, you would also grind it like you did with the bead, right? But actually, in Tunit culture, it seems they were mainly scraping it. So they were taking a scraper and they were scraping it down to shape. So basically what they would do, lie it flat and then scrape along the edges. And I did this for quite a few of my needles in my experiments, and it worked beautifully. Yeah, worked really, really nicely to make that shape. So I might do a little bit of preliminary scraping, see how that goes. And it may just be, for the end, I might still just go out and grind it, the final bit to shape. Yeah, so we're nearly there. We're getting there. We're getting there. Actually, you know what? I've changed my mind. I think I'm going to go out and grind it first and then scrape for the final bit. Yeah, really hoping that I don't break it at this stage because, yeah, it's already quite small. So we'll see how it goes. By the way, those of you who noticed the continuity error in terms of my outfit, that's because I made the mistake of having a lunch break in between sections, and joining me on my lunch break was my 1-year-old daughter, who did eat most of her lunch herself. It went in her tummy, but the rest of it got smeared on my white shirt. So yes, for those of you who hadn't noticed, well done on focusing on the archaeology. Actually, I didn't want to make it any thinner because I was nervous that I would break the perforation or the hole. And what's important is that, I mean, I could try and make the main bit thinner, but then the problem is you'd have this like sudden big bit around the hole, which then just doesn't work. So I found that the best thing is to have like a really gradual increase, because then it's a lot easier, because you can, as long as you get the end through, you can then kind of push it through and get it through that way. What's interesting is that a lot of the times it's assumed that people would have used awls in the past, and by awls I mean a pre-hole maker kind of thing. So generally a larger bone point, for example, and then later on obviously it would have been made from metal. But actually archaeologically, especially in the tunic culture which I'm looking at, there's not actually that much evidence for the use of awls. You don't find many large bone points which have use-wear traces that would be similar to those used by awls. And also if you look at historic accounts, so basically back in the 1500s, 1600s, when the colonizers basically were writing down what they were seeing in terms of what the Inuit were doing every day. So sewing was obviously a large part of life, so they were noting down what was happening, and there's ethnographic accounts of people not using awls, they're just pushing the needles through. So that's what I did in my experiments. I didn't use awls, and it is possible. It takes a while to get the hang of it, and we did sort of push it through, twist a bit, and then kind of pull. And what's really fun is that when you then look at the archaeological needles, you can see that on the needle surfaces. So you can see these long striations which are created when then the needle is pulled through the material, which you can see here wherever I'm putting the video. But what you can also see are these what I call circumferential striations, so they sort of go around the needle, and that's from where it's been pushed in and twisted to then be pulled through, which is very cool. My absolute favorite kind of use-wear trace that you see a lot on needles, mainly bone ones. On ivory needles you don't see it quite as much, but on bone needles you have what's called handling traces. And no one's really sure exactly why these are created. There's been a couple of studies on them, but it's still a relatively unknown thing. But basically you have these tiny little pock marks that form, microscopic pock marks, so you can't see them with the naked eye, on the surface of the needle. And this happens when some sort of reaction happens when living human fingers touch bone, and they create these tiny little pock marks. And so what you can see on the needle, on the archaeological needles, if you look at it microscopically, you can actually see where people were holding the needles and how long they were holding them for, because they build up over time. Whether they were doing the whole length of the needle. So you generally do indeed see more around the sort of closer to the perforation, and then also they're in the bottom half because they were then pulling them through, which I find really, really, really fun. Like you can physically see, you can't quite see a fingerprint, but you can see the closest we'll get really to where they were holding it. So I really like that element of use-wear and of needles in that respect. If you're interested in finding out more about the history of needles and needle making, check out my YouTube shorts, because there I have small reels that I make just in 1 minute talking about the history of particular objects, and I go into a bit more detail about that there. But I hope that this was informative. I hope that you feel like you have a little bit more insight into the needle making process, but also a little bit more appreciation for how important something so apparently insignificant actually is in the history and development of humanity. I mean, without needles, we very much likely wouldn't be where we are today, because without clothing, in a lot of the parts of the world, we wouldn't be able to survive. So thank you to the tiny little needle for helping us get to that stage, to where we are today. all over the world. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, please like the video, please subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to release these on a monthly basis. However, next month I will be on fieldwork in Canada, so I likely will have to do it every 2 months to start with. I haven't decided quite yet what the next one will be, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, look forward to seeing you next time.